man. And so if someone is aware of what's going on and willing to sort of proactively get involved, that's a fantastic scenario. So yeah, I would have them call DCFS. Because there's layers of like how they would gain custody of the child, whether it's transfer of custody, whether it's foster care, and so DCFS can kind of explain their options to them as well. Let's see, where are we? Okay, so the child has a plan. We're starting to work on it. We've had a CASA on the case at this point, so hopefully some of the CASA's input has gone into that plan and the judge's orders going forward. And so now this is really what we think of as in foster care. And I know we explained all of that, but all of that has happened within 45 days. So there's a lot that happens in the beginning of the case. And then court-wise, things slack off after 45 days. It's really intense in the beginning, and then not quite so intense, and maybe should be more intense as the case goes on. So just to kind of give you an idea of a timeline. This is 45 days. Now we're switching to, according to ASFA guidelines, which is a law. So we'll talk about 2 laws right now real quick. But now we're switching to like an every 6 months and 1 year timeline, which is kind of crazy. So there are 2 big laws that we refer to regularly in court proceedings. There's lots of other little laws in child welfare, but everybody doesn't remember all of their acronyms or all of the components of them. But the 2 that are very important are ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, and ASFA, which I need to make sure I say right, Adoption and Safe Families Act. So ICWA is very important because even though we don't have a lot of Native American tribes in Louisiana, in the rest of the country, they do. And there's been serious issues over the last century where as we developed our child welfare law in this country and as we developed the rules around this process, this was crazy and wild and not very well structured, even through the 80s, honestly. There were not a lot of laws around child abuse. There were not a lot of structure and timelines around this process. And so the first sort of populations to really be hurt by that would be the underrepresented populations in our country. And so that really starts with Native American populations who have been marginalized for centuries. And so now what you were seeing happening was if there was an allegation of abuse in a tribe, whatever the state or local government there that wasn't the tribal government would swoop in and they would remove that child from the tribe. They would not make a preference to have the child placed with another tribal member. They wouldn't have, the child's culture was not honored at all. And we still have cultural issues, trust me, in foster care now. But this was especially important because of the years of Indian culture just being marginalized and literally put onto reservations. And so now you've got children who are being removed from reservations, and you've got populations and tribes that were saying, our numbers are dwindling already, and now you're literally taking our children from us. And so because tribes are actually sovereign nations, I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but they are within this country, our federal government defers to Indian tribes on certain matters. And because of ICWA, this is now one of them. The Indian Child Welfare Act basically says if it is a Native American child, and there are very specific rules about what percentage and are they a member of a nationally recognized tribe, and it's not just, I think that child's Indian. It's very specific. But if they are recognized as that protective culture, then the first thing we have to do is defer back to the child. And so very early on in these hearings, the judge is going to ask, is ICWA in play? And somebody better have an answer for that in the courtroom. They've actually investigated, they've determined whether or not that child has Indian blood, and then they've looked back to that tribe. So we actually had a case several years ago in Orleans Parish Juvenile Court where it was a child who had moved in from another state and was living in New Orleans. And so we contacted the tribe up there, and they felt like it was enough degrees of separation. In other words, that child hadn't lived on the reservation. I don't think its parents had lived on the reservation, maybe grandparents or great-grandparents. And so they made the determination that they were just going to monitor the situation from afar and let it stay in Orleans Parish Juvenile Court. If they wanted to, the tribe could have said, we'll handle this, and it would have been transferred to their court system, and we would be out of it. And often in states like Montana and Arizona, and the states that have a larger Indian child population than we do here. Here it's kind of rare, but it still has to be asked at the beginning of every court hearing. We defer back to them and to their tribe to make their own decisions about an Indian child's welfare. Does that make sense? Okay, so then the second law that applies to everybody is ASFA. ASFA, as I said, is the Adoption and Safe Families Act. That was a huge game changer. That attached time limits to everything. We had laws in place about what constitutes abuse. We had laws in place about checking up on foster families, but we really didn't have time limits for these. So a lot of the books you read or a lot of things you read about kids who would go 2 years without appearing in court, or who would literally, like one of my favorite books from foster care is called Little Words. She was in Florida jurisdiction. She ends up in like Georgia or South Carolina for years, and it's like nobody in Florida even knew. It was the 80s. I mean, seriously, it was just up in the air for everybody. So in 1997, we said, okay, time out. Have to have permanency guidelines. Have to shorten the timelines of these things. Can't have kids in foster care for forever, and we need to start permanency planning the minute they come into care, not waiting a while and then starting a permanency plan. It's too late at that point. They've been in care for too long. So that's where you see this right here. Court reviews progress every 6 months and holds a permanency hearing after 12 months. That's ASFA. It says you have to. And so in our court, we actually see cases more often than every 6 months. Most of the courts that I'm aware of, it's 6 months. When I was a CASA in Baton Rouge, literally that's how they would set the next hearing. They would look at the calendar, they would figure out what day was 6 months, and they would set it for 5 months and 29 days later. The last possible time they could see this child again, and then go from there. And that's pretty common in most places. It also said that we have to have a permanency hearing after a year. So 1 year in care, time's up, we need to figure out permanency. It's nice in theory, it doesn't always work in practice because you have to have the permanency hearing or you'll get dinged at feds when they look at things. But there are so many loopholes in that hearing. Well, if the child is placed in a relative and, with a relative and, or if this and so it can be continued and continued and continued. So we still see kids who languish in foster care. We don't see it as great at rates as we used to, and we do have to check in on them a lot more often than we used to have to check in on them. So we have those meetings every so often, and every time we go to court, we determine one of two things. Can the child be reunified with their parents? Has that family of origin completed their case plan, in which case at that hearing we would send them home? Or is it not done yet, in which case we're going to plan another hearing and everybody's going to go back the way they were. So every time we have one of these hearings, it's a really great opportunity for the CASA to come to court and say, also, P.S., here's what I've observed, here's what I think we need to change, here's what needs to be moved going forward. Eventually, if a child has been in care, according to ASFA, 15 out of 22 months, we are supposed to terminate their parental rights. Again, it doesn't always happen. Lots and lots of loopholes, but that's what's supposed to happen. If a parent's rights are terminated, it's pretty much the exact opposite of adoption. Adoption says this child who was absolutely not related to me in any way before is now permanently tied to me, and termination of parental rights means the exact opposite. It says this child who was blood related to me is now a complete stranger, and I have zero rights, zero anything. You're no different than somebody else I saw on the street. It's pretty serious. Termination of parental rights, though, is what needs to happen before a child can be placed for adoption. You have to terminate one parental relationship before you can start another parental relationship. One of the things that ASFA has given us is, instead of having children who are languishing in the system in foster care with no sort of plan, and their parents are still sort of there but not there, maybe working a case and maybe not working a case. Now we have children whose parental rights have been terminated, and basically we have legal orphans. There are over 100,000 kids in this country whose parental rights have been terminated and who have not been adopted. There's no good way for this system to work, because I I would never say that that's a better situation than this one. I would say these are both really terrible situations that we put our children in. Ideally, if the parental rights have been terminated, then we can place the child in a permanent home. So there's somebody who's already ready to adopt them. For our tiny ones, that does usually happen pretty quickly. For our older ones, not so much. So that case would be closed if somebody is willing to take over custody or to adopt the child. Otherwise, the child will remain in foster care, and if they get old enough and they turn 18, they will then age out of foster care, and they're on their own. Good luck with the rest of it. So, you know, we have a lot of teenagers who their case plan is considered APLA, alternative permanent living arrangements. Ideally, when we start out, the case plan is reunification. That's always the first thing we shoot for is reunification. If that doesn't work, then our next case plan would be adoption. Next after that is transfer of rights. That's not as permanent, and of course we're always looking for permanency for a child. And then after that is APLA. So it's by no means an ideal, but we've got 25 to 30,000 kids who age out of foster care every single year. So that's the bulk of what I have to talk about, which is great because I've taken the bulk of our time. Yeah.
Is independent living services, is that what they set you up for the transition of like, you're going to age out, so you're supposed to expect your life?
Yes, theoretically. So independent living classes, right now, the way the court does it, they're mandatory. They usually happen when a child is 14 or 15, and they sit in a classroom like this, and they're taught how to balance a checkbook and how to go shopping and all those other things. Which you're probably aware if you don't use it, you lose it. And so usually what happens is they turn 18 and they go, what? Because they've been given absolutely no opportunities to act independently up until now, and now suddenly they have to be completely independent, which is not a switch that anybody can turn on. That's just not realistic. Independent living in the past has also included transitional housing and apartments. The state has gotten rid of that funding, so we have no transitional living apartments, no independent living housing at all.
How long does CASA follow the child?
We are the first CASA program in the state that has funds to follow a child past 18. So if a child ages out of care, they get to keep their CASA. Most cases though, especially the ones that have some other ending besides aging out at 18, the CASA stays with the child until the child returns home. If the home that they go to, whether it's adoptive or the family of origin, is open to them continuing that relationship with the CASA, we would absolutely encourage it. But that doesn't often happen if they have an outcome that isn't aging out. A lot of times if somebody adopts a child and they want that to be it, clean slate, we're starting our new life. And then the same kind of thing happens if a child is reunified with their family. They don't want to think about this court process whatsoever anymore. They don't want anything that reminds them of that, which even means if the child has developed a bond with a foster parent or a CASA, usually birth parents say, forget it. But if the birth parent doesn't cut off contact, our CASAs are absolutely able to maintain that going forward. Before maybe Diane says a couple of words about being a CASA, I just wanted to let you know some of these other things that are in your hand. This is a list of hearings. It's basically a checklist version of this. And so this is something that we'll give to our CASAs that they can actually fill in the dates and sort of track things. So if you're more linear than this, it's basically the same information. And then this is a written description of each of those hearings in much more technical terms than what I just did here. And then the other thing you have are, these are the parts of the Children's Code. So this is state law in Louisiana that talks about SINC cases, child and needed care cases, that's what we're talking about, that talk about CASA's role. So these are the very sort of technical, legal grounds for the area that we're playing in right now. So do you maybe want to say a couple of words?